On May 2nd, 1945, in the Bavarian Alps, Werner von Braun sat in the back of a commandeered Opel with his left arm in a plaster cast, the result of a car accident 3 weeks earlier. Outside the window, Germany was collapsing. Hitler had been dead for 2 days. The Wehrmacht was surrendering in pieces, and von Braun, at 33, was about to make the most important choice of his life. He'd spent the previous night in a mountain inn with 500 German rocket scientists, assembled carefully with no accidents and no panic. They knew what they had: the V-2 rocket, Hitler's revenge weapon. They knew what it was worth. The British wanted it, the French wanted it, and the Soviets were already moving through Eastern Germany like a storm, hunting for exactly what von Braun carried in file boxes and in the heads of the men sitting beside him. Von Braun had decided: Americans, not Soviets. His younger brother Magnus pedaled through checkpoint lines on a bicycle, looking for American soldiers. When he found them, a patrol from the 44th Infantry Division, he had one sentence ready: "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V-2. We want to surrender to you." By noon, Werner von Braun was shaking hands with American intelligence officers, speaking fluent English with the polite charm that would serve him well for the next 30 years. He explained what he could offer: rockets, guidance systems, years of research the Allies hadn't matched. The officers radioed up the chain, and within days, arrangements were made. The V-2 scientists would move west into American custody. Their families would follow, and food, safety, and work were all guaranteed. No one asked about Mittelbau-Dora, the underground factory where the rockets had been built, and no one asked about the prisoners who died building them. The Americans didn't want to know. They wanted the weapon, they wanted the edge, and von Braun, who dreamed of reaching the stars since childhood, understood something his captors didn't yet realize. He wasn't surrendering. He was shopping for a new patron. The man who built Hitler's revenge weapon was about to build America's space program. The only question was, what would it cost to make him forget? The answer, as it turned out, was a paperclip. By April 1945, Germany had stopped being a functioning country and started being a salvage yard. The Wehrmacht was collapsing, but buried in the wreckage were technologies the Allies hadn't matched. Jet engines years ahead of British designs, supersonic wind tunnels, and rocket guidance systems that turned missiles into precision weapons. The ruins weren't just debris, they were blueprints for the next war. The Americans and British were hunting for facilities, documents, and the scientists who'd designed them. The Red Army was doing the same thing from the east, moving through territory beyond the Elbe River and dismantling entire factories to ship back to Soviet territory. The war against Germany was ending, but the competition for what Germany had built was just beginning. The crown jewel was the V-2 rocket. Between September 1944 and early 1945, over 3,000 V-2s had been fired, most at London, some at Antwerp. They traveled faster than sound, which meant no warning, no defense, just impact. In London alone, more than 500 V-2 strikes killed 2,700 people. The British had no countermeasure, and neither did anyone else. The V-2 wasn't a wonder weapon because it won the war. It didn't. It was a wonder weapon because it represented what came next: long-range missiles that could carry warheads across continents. Hitler had wanted revenge. The Allies wanted replication. The V-2 had been designed at Peenemünde, a research center on the Baltic coast. The British bombed it in 1943, killing 700 people and scattering the scientists. But the program had already moved underground. By May 1945, when American forces reached the facilities, they found technical documents stacked in mine shafts, components hidden in barns, and rocket scientists who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. The scientists weren't hostages. They were negotiating. The Americans moved quickly, securing what they could before the Soviets arrived to claim the same territory. Captured documents went west in trucks, components went west in crates, and by late May, the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington were reviewing proposals for what to do with Germany's rocket program now that Germany no longer had one. The answer came in a single word: Operation Overcast. Bring the scientists to America, extract their knowledge, and keep them out of Soviet hands. On July 20th, 1945, the Joint Chiefs of Staff made Operation Overcast official. The stated goal was dual: extract German expertise for the ongoing war against Japan and secure post-war advantages in military research. The real target, though everyone knew it, was the Soviet Union. A month earlier, the War Department had created the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA for short, to coordinate the scientific exploitation of occupied Germany. The JIOA compiled lists: rocket specialists, aircraft designers, chemical weapons experts, anyone whose knowledge could translate into American advantage. The operation wasn't about curiosity or academic exchange. It was about denying the Soviets what America wanted for itself. In August, President Truman signed a directive making one thing clear: no ardent Nazis. Scientists were already being moved, some to Fort Bliss in Texas, others to Wright Field in Ohio, while their families stayed behind in Germany, waiting to see if the arrangement would become permanent. Food was guaranteed, salaries were negotiated, housing was provided, and the War Department began managing logistics for men whose expertise was valuable enough to overlook where they'd acquired it. Then, in August, Japan surrendered. The war Operation Overcast had been designed to support was over, and the official justification for bringing German scientists to American soil had evaporated overnight. The program didn't stop, it expanded. The JIOA knew exactly who these men were, what they'd built, who they'd built it for, and what they'd done to build it. The choice had already been made. The mission mattered more than the rules, and the Cold War that was beginning mattered more than the war that had just ended. In November 1945, Operation Overcast became Operation Paperclip. The name came from an administrative shortcut. JIOA officers used paperclips to mark the files of scientists deemed high priority for recruitment. The bureaucratic detail outlasted the secrecy. While individual scientists came and went, retired or died, the name Paperclip stuck. By then, the program was operational. In September, 118 German scientists and technicians had arrived at Fort Bliss, a sprawling desert military base outside El Paso, Texas. Their families were still in Germany, writing censored letters and waiting to learn if the arrangement was temporary or permanent. The scientists themselves weren't prisoners, but they weren't free either. White Sands, proving ground, across the border in New Mexico, became the testing site for reassembled V-2s, components shipped west in crates, then put back together by the same men who'd designed them in Germany. The tests weren't just technical validation, they were demonstrations of what America now possessed and what the Soviets didn't. The scientists worked 6 days a week under contracts that designated them as War Department special employees, not refugees, not immigrants, not prisoners, something in between, valuable enough to protect and too useful to let go. By the end of 1945, Operation Paperclip was fully operational, with German rocket scientists on American soil, families waiting in occupied Germany, and facilities preparing for more arrivals. The program that had begun as a salvage operation in the ruins of the Third Reich was now a permanent feature of America's post-war planning. The rules Truman had laid down, temporary contracts, no citizenship, no ardent Nazis, were about to be tested. The choice had been made. Now came the question of what to do when the truth didn't match the narrative. President Truman's August 1945 directive wasn't vague. No ardent Nazis. But the JIOA had a problem. The scientists they wanted most had the worst records. The directive was a political firewall. The concentration camps had just been liberated. The Nuremberg trials were being organized to hold Nazi officials accountable, and American newspapers were running photographs from Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen. Bringing former Nazis to US soil wasn't just controversial, it was politically toxic. The State Department raised objections, worried about diplomatic fallout and the appearance of hypocrisy. The War Department wanted the scientists, but it understood the optics problem. Truman's directive was supposed to satisfy both sides, extract German expertise without rewarding men who'd actively supported Hitler's regime. Werner von Braun had joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and the SS in 1940, eventually holding the rank of Sturmbannführer. He'd visited Mittelbau-Dora, the underground factory where concentration camp prisoners assembled V-2 rockets under conditions that killed thousands. He'd requested additional forced laborers when production fell behind schedule, and declassified testimony later placed him at prisoner selections, choosing who would work and who wouldn't. Arthur Rudolph had run the Mittelwerk factory directly, overseeing the slave labor that produced 900 rockets a month, while prisoners died from starvation, exhaustion, and beatings. Hubertus Strughold, who'd later be called the father of space medicine, had attended a 1942 medical conference in Nuremberg, where SS physicians presented research from Dachau, hypothermia experiments conducted on camp prisoners. These weren't minor figures orbiting the edges of the program. They were the program, the engineers and scientists who designed the systems America wanted to replicate. Replacing them wasn't an option. They'd built the V-2 from concept to deployment, and no one else had that knowledge. Truman's directive said, exclude them. The JIOA's mission said acquire them. The gap between Washington's ethics and field practice was becoming a canyon. The JIOA's solution was simple: rewrite the past. Files were pulled, reviewed, and edited. Employment histories were created that omitted Nazi Party years entirely or framed membership as nominal, perfunctory, a career requirement in a totalitarian state, nothing more. What couldn't be erased was recontextualized. Men who'd worked in weapons programs became scientists whose expertise had been commandeered by a regime they hadn't supported. Werner von Braun's SS membership disappeared from his dossier. The man who'd held the rank of Sturmbannführer, who'd worn the uniform and reported to Himmler's organization, was presented in official documents as an apolitical scientist whose only crime was being too talented for the Nazis to ignore. Arthur Rudolph, who'd overseen production at Mittelwerk and requested thousands of additional camp prisoners to meet rocket quotas, was reframed as a manager handling production under difficult wartime conditions. The prisoners who died from exhaustion, starvation, beatings weren't mentioned. The moral calculation was left out of the equation. Strughold's attendance at the 1942 Nuremberg Medical Conference, where SS doctors presented hypothermia research conducted on Dachau prisoners, vanished from the record. He became a respected aeromedical researcher with no inconvenient questions about where his colleagues had gathered their data. What the JIOA created was a category that shouldn't have been possible: good Nazis. Men who'd joined the party, advanced their careers under Hitler, contributed to the war machine, but who could be separated from their actions because their knowledge was too valuable to reject. The justification was always the same. Expertise could be separated from ideology. Desperation could excuse collaboration. The work mattered more than the worker's history, and America's future mattered more than Germany's past. By 1946, the sanitized files were in circulation. Scientists whose records should have disqualified them were being cleared for entry, and the gap between what Truman's directive required and what the JIOA delivered had become policy. Opposition existed. It was voiced publicly, recorded in letters and newspaper columns, and presented directly to President Truman. It just never gained traction. Eleanor Roosevelt opposed the program both publicly and privately, writing in her newspaper column that bringing former Nazis to America contradicted everything the country had fought for. Her argument wasn't just moral, it was practical. Welcoming men who'd worked for Hitler made a mockery of the soldiers who died fighting Germany. It was a question of national character, she wrote, whether America would choose expedience over principle. Albert Einstein's opposition was quieter. Some of his family and colleagues had died in concentration camps, and he made his position clear in private correspondence. Knowledge wasn't worth the moral cost of absolving men who'd enabled atrocities. The work they'd done couldn't be separated from the context in which they'd done it. In 1947, the Federation of American Scientists sent formal objections to the White House, calling Operation Paperclip a drastic step in the search for military power. Their concerns weren't just ethical, they worried about creating dependencies on men whose loyalties were uncertain and sending a message that morality was negotiable when technical advantage was at stake. The State Department continued raising objections through 1946 and 1947, concerned about diplomatic fallout and the appearance of Allied hypocrisy. Parts of the Justice Department questioned the legality of a program that seemed designed to violate the president's own directive. None of it mattered. The objections couldn't compete with Cold War logic. The Soviets were absorbing their own scientists from Eastern Germany, thousands of them, and the argument that America couldn't afford to fall behind became self-evident. The question wasn't whether to bring German scientists to the United States. The question was whether America could match Soviet acquisitions or fall behind before the next war started. The objectors were heard. Their concerns were noted, filed, and ignored. The program continued exactly as planned. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. Truman's directive provided the appearance of ethical standards. The JIOA's sanitization provided plausible deniability. The objectors provided a record of dissent. And the Cold War provided the justification that made the whole arrangement not just acceptable, but necessary. By 1947, the argument didn't need defending anymore. The Soviets had absorbed thousands of German scientists from the eastern occupied zones, and America's choice wasn't between the moral option and the strategic option. It was between matching Soviet acquisitions or falling behind before the next war even started. The scientists arrived in waves through 1946 and 1947. They worked at Fort Bliss, Wright Field, and research facilities nationwide, their sanitized personnel files replacing the historical record. The rules Truman had laid down became guidelines, then suggestions, then obstacles to work around. National security, the logic went, required moral flexibility. The ends justified the erasure, and by the time the truth began emerging decades later, the scientists had already helped build the arsenal that won the Cold War. Operation Paperclip wasn't a failure of American values. It was a calculated decision about which values mattered more. Werner von Braun was born in 1912 to Prussian aristocracy, and by the time he was 12, he'd decided his future would involve rockets and space travel. The dream never changed, only the patrons who funded it. By the time he surrendered to American forces in May 1945, von Braun had already spent 15 years building the infrastructure to reach orbit. He directed the Peenemünde Research Center, designed the V-2 from concept to deployment, and navigated the politics of working for a totalitarian regime that valued results over ethics. What made von Braun valuable wasn't just technical expertise, it was his ability to sell the dream. He spoke fluent English, understood American culture better than most of his colleagues, and had the kind of charisma that made complex engineering accessible to congressmen and presidents. He wasn't just a scientist explaining rockets. He was a visionary, describing humanity's future in space, and he knew exactly how to make that future sound inevitable. His willingness to compromise, morally, politically, professionally, was what allowed him to survive the Third Reich and thrive in America. He'd joined the Nazi Party when it advanced his career, joined the SS when it protected his work, and looked the other way when prisoners died building his rockets because the mission mattered more than the cost. After the war, that same flexibility made him indispensable. He gave Americans what they wanted: technical brilliance without uncomfortable questions. He played the role of the reformed scientist, the man whose genius had been commandeered by evil and who now wanted nothing more than to contribute to peaceful exploration. The assessment from those who worked with him was consistent: brilliant, ambitious, and morally flexible enough to partner with anyone who could get him closer to space. Wernher von Braun wasn't a reluctant participant in America's space program. He was its architect, its most effective advocate, and eventually, its public face. The man who'd surrendered in the Bavarian Alps wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking for the resources to continue his work, regardless of who provided them. America was willing to pay the price. Arthur Rudolph was the operations director at the Mittelwerk factory, the underground facility where 60,000 concentration camp prisoners built V-2 rockets under conditions that killed 1 in 3. Rudolph oversaw production, managed quotas, and requested additional laborers when output fell behind schedule. The prisoners who died, from exhaustion, starvation, unsafe working conditions, and beatings, weren't incidental to the operation. They were the labor pool Rudolph drew from to meet targets. Production mattered more than survival, and Rudolph ensured the rockets kept moving down the assembly line, regardless of the cost in human lives. After the war, Rudolph's expertise made him valuable. He worked on the Pershing missile program, contributed to the development of the Saturn V rocket, and was recognized as one of NASA's most accomplished engineers. The records that should have disqualified him from entry had been sanitized, and for nearly 40 years, his wartime role remained buried in classified files. Arthur Rudolph was the manager who prioritized production over lives, the engineer whose accomplishments were built on a foundation of slave labor and death. His post-war career would proceed without interruption for nearly 4 decades. Hubertus Strughold earned the title Father of Space Medicine for his post-war work developing protocols that allowed humans to survive in high-altitude and zero-gravity environments. What the title didn't mention was where some of that knowledge came from. Strughold had been the head of aeromedical research for the Luftwaffe during the war. In 1942, he attended a medical conference in Nuremberg, where SS physician Sigmund Rascher presented research on hypothermia tolerance, experiments conducted on prisoners at Dachau concentration camp. Strughold was in the room when colleagues described submerging prisoners in ice water to measure how long humans could survive extreme cold. In 1946, Strughold's name appeared on a list of possible war criminals. Some of his colleagues were convicted at the Nuremberg doctors' trial for conducting or enabling human experiments. Strughold was never charged. Instead, he continued his career in America. He worked for NASA, advised the Air Force on aeromedical research, and contributed to programs that sent astronauts into space. His expertise in human physiology under extreme conditions made him valuable, and the sanitized personnel file ensured no one asked uncomfortable questions about where that expertise had been acquired. By the 1980s and 1990s, as more records were declassified, historians began connecting Strughold's presence at the 1942 conference to the research being presented. His name was removed from awards, buildings named in his honor were renamed, and the title, Father of Space Medicine, became an embarrassment rather than an honor. Hubertus Strughold died in 1986, never prosecuted and never required to answer for what he witnessed or how it informed his work. He was the witness who benefited from what he saw, honored for decades, then quietly disgraced, but never punished. Walter Dornberger had been von Braun's commanding officer at Peenemünde, the military overseer who ensured the V2 program met Wehrmacht requirements. He'd surrendered alongside von Braun in May 1945, was held as a war crime suspect for 2 years, then quietly released and brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Dornberger worked for Bell Aircraft and later the Air Force, advising on guided missile development and contributing to programs that evolved into modern aerospace systems. His wartime role, overseeing the weapons program that killed thousands of civilians, was filed away as inconvenient history. He lived in the United States until his death in 1980, honored as a pioneer in rocketry, never prosecuted for his role in the V2 attacks on London and Antwerp. Von Braun, Rudolph, Strughold, and Dornberger weren't outliers. They were representative of the Operation Paperclip roster. The 118 scientists who arrived in September 1945 included chemists who'd developed nerve agents, aerodynamics experts who'd tested designs in wind tunnels built by camp labor, and physicians whose research had been conducted on prisoners who had no choice in participation. Some had joined the Nazi Party because refusal meant the end of their careers. Others joined enthusiastically. Some had looked away when prisoners died. Others had signed the requisitions that sent more prisoners to the factories. The degrees of complicity varied, but the pattern didn't. Expertise that America wanted, acquired under circumstances America chose to ignore. By 1950, the program had expanded beyond the original group. More than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, many with families, all with personnel files that omitted or reframed anything that might disqualify them. They worked at military installations, aerospace companies, research universities, and government laboratories. They contributed to missile programs, satellite development, chemical weapons research, and medical advances. Their expertise accelerated American technological development by years, possibly decades. The cost was accountability. The price was the knowledge that America had chosen expedience over justice, and that the men who'd enabled atrocities were being rewarded rather than tried. At 2 a.m. on October 22, 1946, Soviet forces began rounding up German scientists in the Eastern Occupation Zone. The operation wasn't a negotiation, it was a mass relocation at gunpoint. Operation Osoavia Kim targeted rocket engineers, aviation specialists, electronics experts, and their families. Estimates vary, but between 2,200 and 7,000 specialists were relocated overnight. The Soviets didn't ask for volunteers, didn't sanitize personnel files, and didn't pretend the arrangement was anything other than forced labor disguised as war reparations. Entire families were moved, sometimes with hours' notice, sometimes with none. Factories were dismantled, equipment was shipped east, and the scientists who understood how to operate that equipment went with it. The justification was straightforward. Germany had waged war on the Soviet Union, killed 27 million Soviet citizens, and now would contribute to Soviet reconstruction, whether it wanted to or not. The difference between the American and Soviet programs wasn't in what they did. Both relocated scientists, both exploited German expertise, both bypassed accountability for war crimes. The difference was in how they justified it. The Americans sanitized files, created narratives about apolitical scientists, and pretended the men they brought to Texas had been victims of the Nazi regime rather than collaborators. The program required plausible deniability because American values, at least in theory, didn't allow for importing war criminals. The Soviets made no such claims. They took what they wanted, treated the acquisition as spoils of war, and didn't bother constructing moral cover stories. The scientists weren't offered citizenship, weren't promised permanent residency, and weren't presented as refugees seeking freedom. They were labor assets, and when their usefulness expired, most were sent back to East Germany by the mid-1950s. Operation Ossoaviakim lasted a single night. By morning, thousands of German specialists had been relocated to facilities across Soviet territory, where they worked under supervision, contributed to missile and aviation programs, and waited to see if they'd ever be allowed to leave. The Soviets took what they wanted and made no apologies. The operation was public, unapologetic, and consistent with how the Soviet Union treated occupied Germany as a defeated enemy nation that owed reparations in blood, labor, and knowledge. Each superpower justified its program by pointing at the other. The Americans argued that if they didn't acquire German scientists, the Soviets would, and by 1947, that argument didn't need elaboration because the Soviets had already demonstrated they'd do exactly that. The Soviet response was simpler. The Americans had already done it, so why shouldn't they? Moral equivalence became a strategic tool. Both nations framed the acquisition as a defensive necessity, a race to deny the enemy an advantage neither could afford to concede. The ethics of importing war criminals became secondary to the tactical question of whether one superpower would allow the other to monopolize German expertise. What both nations revealed through their parallel programs was a willingness to compromise foundational ethics for strategic power. National security trumped accountability. Former enemies became useful resources as long as their skills compensated for their histories. The architecture of both programs, American sanitization and Soviet appropriation, reflected the same underlying calculation. Winning the next war mattered more than punishing crimes from the last one. The myth that shattered most visibly was American exceptionalism. The United States had positioned itself as the moral victor of World War II, the nation that fought for freedom and accountability. Operation Paperclip undermined that claim. If the Soviets relocated scientists at gunpoint and the Americans did it with paperwork, the methods differed, but the outcome didn't. Both superpowers prioritized advantage over justice. The question the mirror raised was uncomfortable. If both sides did it, who retained moral authority? The answer, by the late 1940s, was that neither did. The Cold War wasn't a contest between virtue and tyranny. It was a competition between two powers willing to sacrifice their stated values for strategic dominance. The mirror shows what you don't want to see. For America, that reflection was the gap between the principles it exported and the compromises it made when those principles became inconvenient. Mittelbau-Dora was a concentration camp built inside a mountain. The camp and the factory inside it, called Mittelwerk, were integrated systems with a single purpose: produce V-2 rockets faster than the prisoners who built them could die. The Mittelwerk factory was carved into the Kohnstein, a limestone formation in central Germany near the town of Nordhausen, Thuringia. The tunnels extended 13 miles into solid rock, arranged in 2 parallel shafts, connected by 46 cross-tunnels. The facility had been designed before the war as a fuel depot, but in August 1943, after the British bombed Peenemünde, Albert Speer and SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler repurposed it for V-2 production. The goal was to move rocket manufacturing underground, beyond the reach of Allied bombers, and scale production to 900 V-2s per month, a rate the Peenemünde facility had never approached. The workforce was prisoners from the concentration camp system. Between August 1943 and March 1945, approximately 60,000 men cycled through Mittelbau-Dora. They were housed in wooden barracks built near the tunnel entrances, though during the initial construction phase in late 1943, many slept inside the tunnels themselves. No sunlight, no fresh air, 18-hour shifts, excavating rock and installing machinery. The camp was administered by the SS. The factory was managed by Mittelwerk GmbH, a subsidiary of the SS economic apparatus, with Arthur Rudolph serving as operations director. The production line ran continuously. Prisoners assembled guidance systems, welded fuel tanks, installed warhead mechanisms, and tested propulsion systems. When output fell behind quota, Rudolph requested additional labor. The SS supplied it. The work was industrial manufacturing conducted under concentration camp conditions. Food rations were calculated to sustain labor output, not health. Medical care was minimal. Injuries were common, infections frequently fatal. The tunnels were cold, damp, and filled with rock dust from ongoing excavation. Prisoners worked until they couldn't, then were replaced. The factory succeeded in its purpose. By early 1944, Mittelwerk was producing rockets at a scale Peenemünde never managed. The V2s built in those tunnels were the same ones fired at London, Antwerp, and other Allied targets, technically sophisticated weapons manufactured by forced labor, under conditions designed to extract maximum output, with minimal concern for human cost. When American forces liberated the camp in April 1945, they found the tunnels intact, the machinery operational, and thousands of prisoners in various states of physical collapse. The V2 components were documented, crated, and shipped to White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. The scientists who'd overseen production were interviewed, evaluated, and recruited. The camp itself was handed over to Soviet occupation forces when the zone boundaries were redrawn. The tunnels were eventually sealed. Between August 1943 and March 1945, between 20,000 and 25,000 prisoners died at Mittelbau-Dora. The exact number is uncertain. Camp records were incomplete, deaths weren't always documented, and many prisoners were transferred to other camps before they died. What's certain is that roughly 1 in 3 prisoners who entered Mittelbau-Dora didn't survive it. The mortality rate peaked in late 1943 and early 1944, during the initial construction phase, when prisoners were expanding the tunnels while simultaneously beginning production. In October 1943 alone, the camp recorded more than 600 deaths. Between October 1943 and March 1944, approximately 2,900 prisoners died in the camp, and an additional 3,000 were sent to Bergen-Belsen, a transfer that functioned as a death sentence, since Bergen-Belsen had no medical facilities capable of treating the injuries and illnesses acquired at Mittelbau-Dora. By the end of 1943, Mittelbau-Dora had the highest death rate in the concentration camp system. The comparison is unavoidable. The V2 killed approximately 2,700 people in London and another 1,600 in Antwerp and other targets, roughly 4,300 combat casualties total. The construction and production of those rockets killed 5 times as many people. For every person killed by a V2 during the war, 5 prisoners died building it. The weapon was less effective at destroying enemy cities than it was at consuming the lives of the people forced to manufacture it. The V2 wasn't just a failure as a strategic weapon, it was a monument to inverted priorities, a system where production quotas mattered more than the human cost of meeting them. The prisoners who survived Mittelbau-Dora were liberated by American forces in April 1945. Many were too weak to walk, suffering from malnutrition, tuberculosis, and untreated injuries. The camp was documented. The survivors were evacuated to displaced persons facilities, and within weeks, American engineers were inside the tunnels cataloging V2 components for shipment. Arthur Rudolph's role as operations director was noted in captured documents, but the context, the mortality rate, the working conditions, the scale of forced labor was filed, not prosecuted. The priority was extracting technical knowledge, and the scientists who possessed that knowledge were more valuable than accountability for how it had been acquired. Werner von Braun visited Mittelbau-Dora multiple times between 1943 and 1945. The visits were documented. in factory records, in testimony provided by camp survivors after the war, and in declassified SS documents. He toured the production lines, inspected V2 components, reviewed technical specifications, and discussed production bottlenecks with Arthur Rudolph and other Mittelwerk managers. The prisoners were visible. They assembled rockets under guard, worked 18-hour shifts without adequate food, and collapsed from exhaustion on the factory floor. The conditions weren't hidden. They were the method by which production quotas were met. Declassified testimony from camp survivors, not from von Braun himself, who would never testify under oath about Mittelwerk, placed von Braun at prisoner selections, where technical specialists were chosen for specific tasks, and others were deemed expendable. The testimony was contested, the details disputed, but the pattern was consistent. Von Braun was present at Mittelwerk. He observed the labor conditions, and he continued working with Rudolph to meet production targets. Arthur Rudolph's role was more direct. As operations director, he managed workforce allocation, requested additional laborers from the SS when quotas weren't met, and signed production reports documenting output alongside mortality. His job was ensuring that 900 V2s per month left the production line regardless of what it cost in human lives. The requests for forced labor were documented, specific requisitions, dated and signed, asking for additional prisoners to replace those who died or become too weak to work. After the war, both men offered versions of the same defense. They didn't know the full extent of the conditions. They had no choice but to comply with SS administration, and their roles were technical rather than administrative. Von Braun claimed he'd been focused on rocket engineering, not camp management. Rudolph argued he'd been managing production under difficult wartime conditions and had no authority over how the SS treated prisoners. The defense relied on a separation that didn't exist. The camp and the factory weren't distinct entities. They were integrated systems. The prisoners who died building V2s were the same workforce von Braun and Rudolph depended on to meet technical and production goals. The expertise both men offered America after the war had been developed, tested, and refined, using forced labor under conditions that killed 20,000 people. The question wasn't whether they knew. The question was whether knowing mattered more than the value of what they could build next. America's answer, through Operation Paperclip, was no. The 118 German scientists who arrived at Fort Bliss in September 1945 were designated War Department Special Employees, a bureaucratic category that meant they weren't prisoners, weren't refugees, and weren't immigrants. They existed in administrative limbo, valuable enough to import, but not trusted enough to integrate. The initial accommodations reflected that ambiguity. They were housed in military barracks on the base, under loose supervision that amounted to confinement without calling it that. They couldn't leave the base without permission, couldn't travel freely, and had limited contact with the outside world. The facilities at Fort Bliss were functional but austere. For the first several weeks, there weren't even proper showers, just makeshift arrangements that underscored the provisional nature of the program. Their work, however, began immediately. At White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, the reassembled V2 rockets they'd helped build in Germany were being prepared for test launches. The scientists provided technical expertise, troubleshot mechanical failures, and advised American engineers on propulsion systems and guidance mechanisms. The rockets they'd designed to hit London were now being used to test atmospheric conditions and prove concepts that would eventually inform intercontinental ballistic missile development. As the scientists proved their value, conditions improved. Better housing was provided. Restrictions eased. By December 1946, the War Department made the program public, acknowledging that German scientists were assisting American missile research. The announcement was carefully framed. These were technical experts whose knowledge was too valuable to leave idle, men who wanted to contribute to peaceful scientific advancement. Public reaction was mixed. Some newspapers expressed fascination with the technological achievements, running features about rocket science and the men who'd pioneered it. Others voiced unease, questioning why America was employing scientists who'd worked for Hitler, while so many veterans struggled to find work in the post-war economy. The criticism never gained enough traction to threaten the program, but it was loud enough to create discomfort in the War Department. Beginning in late 1946 and accelerating through 1947, families began arriving from Germany. Wives and children who'd waited in occupied zones for nearly 2 years were reunited with husbands and fathers who'd left on what had been presented as temporary assignments. The family reunifications softened the optics. These weren't just scientists working on military contracts. They were men building new lives in America, contributing expertise while raising children and establishing roots. By 1950, the transformation was nearly complete. The men who'd arrived under guard in 1945 were giving lectures at universities, consulting with aerospace companies, and appearing in media coverage that portrayed them as visionary engineers rather than former Nazi employees. The journey from war criminals to valued assets had taken 5 years, a combination of strategic necessity, bureaucratic sanitization, and public willingness to prioritize technological advantage over uncomfortable questions about the past. The scientists weren't prisoners anymore. They were employees, contributors, and, increasingly, Americans. In 1950, 200 German scientists relocated from Fort Bliss to Huntsville, Alabama. Most had been reunited with their families during the gradual arrivals between 1946 and 1949. By the time of the Huntsville move, the scientists were no longer isolated individuals, but established family units. The Army had chosen Huntsville as the site for its new Redstone Arsenal, a facility dedicated to developing battlefield missiles and rocket propulsion systems. The Germans would form the technical core of the operation, and Huntsville, population 15,000, would transform into the center of American missile development. The population exploded. By 1955, Huntsville had grown to 38,000, fueled by Army contracts, aerospace companies, and the infrastructure needed to support rocket research. The Germans settled primarily in College Hill, a neighborhood that became the de facto German community hub. German bakeries opened, German social clubs formed, and on weekends, families gathered for events that felt transplanted from Bavaria: lederhosen, traditional music, and a German symphony orchestra that gave concerts at local venues. Huntsville welcomed them. The city organized parades celebrating the German scientists. Local businesses advertised of Deutsch to attract their patronage, and civic leaders framed the relocation as an economic windfall. The Germans brought jobs, prestige, and federal funding. They were the reason Huntsville was becoming Rocket City, and the community embraced that identity enthusiastically. By the mid-1950s, von Braun had become a local celebrity. He gave speeches at Rotary clubs, appeared in local newspapers, and served as the public face of missile development. The man who'd surrendered in the Bavarian Alps a decade earlier was now an honored resident of Alabama, his Nazi credentials either unknown or deliberately ignored by a community that valued what he could contribute more than what he'd done. The German scientists relocated to Huntsville, Alabama in 1950, a state operating under strict Jim Crow segregation. Black citizens couldn't vote without facing intimidation or bureaucratic obstacles designed to disenfranchise them. They couldn't eat at the same restaurants as white residents, couldn't use the same water fountains, and sent their children to underfunded, segregated schools. Black veterans who'd fought in World War II returned home to a system that denied them the rights they'd risked their lives defending. The German scientists, many of whom weren't American citizens, some of whom had been Nazi party members, several of whom had overseen slave labor, were welcomed into white society without hesitation. They ate at whites-only restaurants. Their children attended white schools, They joined country clubs, participated in civic organizations, and socialized with Huntsville's elite, without encountering the restrictions that governed black residents' lives. The contradiction was stark. A black veteran who'd served in the Pacific or European theater couldn't sit at the same lunch counter as Werner von Braun, a former SS officer who'd built rockets using concentration camp prisoners. The German scientists' technical expertise granted them an exemption from the racial hierarchy that structured Southern life, not because the system had changed, but because their value to the missile program outweighed any discomfort about their presence in white spaces. Jim Crow had an exception clause. If you were useful enough, the rules could be adjusted. The German scientists were proof that America's commitment to segregation was flexible when strategic interests required it, and that moral calculations about who deserved inclusion could be overridden by questions about who could advance national security. The black residents of Huntsville didn't have expertise America needed, so the system didn't bend for them. By the mid-1950s, many of the German scientists had done what Truman's directive had explicitly prohibited. They'd become permanent residents, and eventually, American citizens. The prohibition had been clear. Temporary contracts only, no path to citizenship, no permanent status. But as the Cold War intensified and the scientists proved indispensable to missile development, the restrictions eroded. In 1954, Congress passed legislation allowing Operation Paperclip scientists to apply for citizenship without leaving the country. The requirement that they return to Germany before seeking re-entry as immigrants, a safeguard designed to prevent permanent settlement, was waived. Werner von Braun became a US citizen in 1955. Arthur Rudolph followed in 1954. The men who'd been brought to America under the fiction that their stay would be brief were now Americans, with all the rights and privileges that status conferred. The prosperity followed. Von Braun's salary at the Army's missile program was comfortable, but his real income came from consulting, public speaking, and media appearances. He wrote articles for popular magazines, appeared on television programs explaining rocketry to American audiences, and consulted with aerospace companies developing commercial applications for missile technology. By the 1960s, many of the Paperclip scientists had achieved financial security that would have been unimaginable in post-war Germany. They owned homes, sent their children to American universities, and participated in the economic expansion that defined the era. The decision to accept America's offer in 1945 had been calculated, trading accountability for opportunity, and the calculation had paid off. The men who'd built weapons for Hitler were now building missiles for America, and America rewarded them for it. In 1960, the transition became official. Von Braun and his team were transferred from the Army's Redstone Arsenal to the newly created National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, established 2 years earlier in 1958. The Army's missile program became the civilian space program. Huntsville, which had been the center of American military rocketry, became the heart of the effort to reach the moon. By the mid-1950s, Werner von Braun had become America's most effective advocate for space exploration. He wasn't just designing rockets, he was selling the future. In 1952, von Braun began contributing articles to Collier's magazine, a widely read publication that reached millions of American households. The series, titled "Man Will Conquer Space Soon," featured elaborate illustrations of space stations, lunar bases, and Mars expeditions. Von Braun wrote with authority and enthusiasm, describing technical challenges in language accessible to general audiences, and framing space travel not as science fiction, but as inevitable engineering achievement. The articles made him famous. He wasn't a former Nazi rocket scientist anymore. He was the man who would send America to space. In 1955, Walt Disney invited von Braun to appear in a series of television programs explaining rocketry and space exploration to American families. The show, Man in Space, aired on ABC and was watched by 42 million people, roughly a quarter of the US population. Von Braun stood at a chalkboard, explained orbital mechanics, and described how rockets could carry satellites and eventually humans beyond Earth's atmosphere. His presentation was clear, charismatic, and devoid of any reference to V2s, Mittelwerk, or the concentration camp prisoners who'd built the weapons that made his expertise possible. Disney followed with Man and the Moon and Mars and Beyond, both featuring von Braun as the primary expert. The shows were designed for children and families, positioning von Braun as a visionary scientist whose work represented American ingenuity and ambition. The transformation was complete. The man who joined the Nazi Party in 1937, the SS in 1940, and overseen rocket production using slave labor was now the face of American space exploration. His past wasn't hidden. Military intelligence knew exactly who he was and what he'd done, but it was irrelevant to the public image being cultivated. Von Braun's value wasn't just technical. He could explain complex engineering in terms anyone could understand. He looked the part of a visionary scientist, and he embodied the optimism Americans wanted to feel about technological progress. The Cold War needed heroes who could compete with Soviet achievements, and von Braun was willing to play the role. By 1960, when NASA was preparing to send astronauts to space, von Braun was the agency's most recognizable scientist. The whitewashing hadn't required rewriting history. It had simply required focusing on the future and letting the past fade into irrelevance. In the 1960s, as civil rights protests intensified across the American South, Wernher von Braun, former SS member who'd overseen slave labor in Nazi Germany, became an unlikely advocate for desegregation. He spoke at Alabama A&M and Miles College, historically black universities, recruiting students for NASA programs. He testified before Alabama state officials about the need to integrate Huntsville's schools and public facilities, arguing that segregation damaged the city's reputation and made it harder to attract top scientific talent. In 1965, he confronted Governor George Wallace directly, pushing for policies that would allow black engineers and scientists to work at Marshall Space Flight Center without facing the indignities of Jim Crow. The advocacy was real. It was also calculated. NASA needed to project an image of progress and equality, and having its most visible scientist champion civil rights helped counter criticism that the space program was a taxpayer-funded project serving white interests, while black Americans struggled for basic rights. The irony was unavoidable. The same man who'd built rockets using concentration camp prisoners was now championing equality for black Americans. In a state where black veterans who'd fought in World War II still couldn't vote without facing violence or bureaucratic obstruction. Was the advocacy genuine, or was it public relations? The answer was probably both. Von Braun understood systems of power. He'd navigated the Nazi regime by making himself indispensable, and he navigated American society the same way, by aligning his public positions with whatever enhanced his value to the institutions that protected him. The contradictions of redemption. A former Nazi advocating for civil rights while living in a state that denied those rights to its black citizens, celebrated as a moral voice while his past remained carefully unexamined. Von Braun's public image transformed in stages, each carefully managed to serve America's strategic needs. How was the narrative controlled for so long? Military censorship in the early years, NASA's public relations machine throughout the 1960s, media complicity in accepting the official story, and von Braun's own charisma, his ability to explain complex concepts clearly, to embody optimism about humanity's future, to make people forget that expertise acquired in one context doesn't erase what was done to acquire it. By the time the truth fully emerged in the 1980s, the myth was too useful to destroy. America had gone to the moon, won the space race, and validated decades of investment in missile technology. The man who'd helped achieve that couldn't be fully discredited without calling the achievements themselves into question. The whitewashing was complete, not because the past was erased, but because success had made it irrelevant. For nearly 4 decades after World War II ended, none of the German scientists brought to America under Operation Paperclip faced prosecution for war crimes. No trials, no convictions, no legal accountability that resulted in consequences. The reason was strategic. The Cold War made accountability inconvenient. The scientists weren't just employees, they were designated national security assets, a classification that functioned as legal armor. The Army, and later NASA, controlled the narrative around the program, framing the scientists as apolitical experts whose knowledge served American interests. Any investigation that threatened their status also threatened the missile programs and space initiatives they'd built. The public was either unaware or uncaring. Most Americans didn't know the details of Operation Paperclip, and those who did were more interested in beating the Soviets to space than in pursuing justice for crimes committed in another country during a war that had ended. The narrative that dominated, German scientists as brilliant refugees who'd chosen freedom over tyranny, was easier to accept than the truth. The media was complicit. Journalists who profiled von Braun or covered NASA's achievements rarely pressed on uncomfortable questions. When his Nazi Party membership or SS rank came up, it was mentioned briefly and contextualized as forced participation, not willing collaboration. The deeper questions, about Mittelwerk, about the prisoners, about what he'd known and when, went unasked. For decades, the system worked exactly as designed. The scientists contributed technical expertise. America advanced its strategic goals, and no one asked what price had been paid for that advancement. The secret America kept from itself was that justice had been a negotiable value, something that could be set aside when more important priorities emerged. The reckoning didn't come because no one with power wanted it to. The first crack in the silence came in 1984, when Arthur Rudolph, facing a Justice Department investigation into his role at Mittelwerk, renounced his US citizenship and left the country rather than face prosecution. He returned to West Germany and lived there until his death in 1996, never standing trial. The 1980s brought limited declassification of Operation Paperclip records. Some files were released, revealing fragments of what had been sanitized, evidence of Nazi Party memberships that had been scrubbed from dossiers, documentation of roles at concentration camps that had been omitted from official biographies, and internal memos showing that military intelligence had known exactly who these men were and what they'd done. The fuller disclosure came in 1998, when President Clinton signed the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. The legislation mandated the release of classified records related to Nazi war criminals and US government interactions with them. Over the following years, millions of pages of documents were declassified, including Operation Paperclip files that revealed the full extent of the sanitization program. The files confirmed what investigators had suspected. Von Braun had made documented visits to Mittelbau-Dora, toured the production lines where prisoners worked under lethal conditions, and participated in technical meetings with Arthur Rudolph about labor allocation. Rudolph's role wasn't just managerial. He'd signed requisition forms requesting additional forced laborers to replace those who died or become too weak to work. Strughold's attendance at the 1942 Nuremberg Conference, where Dachau hypothermia experiments were presented, was documented in SS records. In 2014, journalist Annie Jacobsen published Operation Paperclip, the secret intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to America, the first comprehensive account drawing on the declassified files. The book detailed the sanitization process, the extent of complicity, and the deliberate decisions made by American officials to prioritize technical knowledge over accountability. The truth emerged 70 years after the war ended, long after most of the scientists had died, long after accountability could mean anything more than historical record. The 1984 Rudolph case represented the closest thing to accountability Operation Paperclip ever produced. The Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, established in 1979 to pursue Nazi war criminals living in the United States, began examining his wartime record. Rather than face prosecution, Rudolph negotiated an agreement. He would renounce his citizenship and leave the country voluntarily. He returned to West Germany, where he lived comfortably until his death in 1996, never standing trial for his role at Mittelwerk. Hubertus Strughold faced multiple investigations, but never prosecution. In 1958, he was first questioned about his attendance at the 1942 Nuremberg Medical Conference. The investigation was reopened in 1974, then again in 1983, each time revealing more evidence of his involvement with Nazi medical experiments. Each time, the investigation closed without charges being filed. Strughold died in 1986, never having faced legal consequences for what he'd witnessed or enabled. The pattern was consistent: investigation without prosecution. When accountability finally arrived, it took the form of symbolic gestures, names removed from plaques, honors rescinded posthumously, buildings quietly renamed. In the 1990s, the Air Force Library at Brooks Air Force Base, named after Strughold, was renamed. His induction into the International Space Hall of Fame was questioned, and eventually his name was removed from commemorative materials. Accountability, such as it was, measured in plaques removed and honors withdrawn after the honorees had died. The substantive reckoning, trials, testimony, legal judgment never came. Werner von Braun died in 1977, 20 years before the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act brought full transparency to Operation Paperclip. He never faced trial, never testified under oath about Mittelwerk, and never answered for what he'd done or known. He was celebrated at his death as a visionary who'd helped America reach the moon. Most of the Operation Paperclip scientists followed similar trajectories. They lived full American lives, contributed to aerospace and defense research, retired with pensions and honors, and died as respected members of their communities. Their families kept the legacies, the financial security, and the social status that came from association with America's space program. The calculation they'd made in 1945, accepting America's offer, trading accountability for opportunity, proved correct. The strategy was simple: contribute enough value that the system protecting you never wavers, and wait long enough that anyone who might demand justice either forgets or dies. By the time declassified files revealed the truth, the men whose actions those files documented were beyond the reach of any courtroom. Justice delayed became justice denied. The reckoning that should have come in 1945 didn't arrive until the 1980s, and by then it was too late for anything resembling accountability. What remained was historical record, posthumous disgrace for a few, and the uncomfortable truth that America had chosen strategic advantage over moral reckoning, and never regretted it enough to change course. The Operation Paperclip scientists didn't just build rockets. Their expertise extended across the full spectrum of advanced military technology, shaping fields that would define the Cold War and beyond. Swept-wing aircraft design, technology decades ahead of American capabilities in 1945, came directly from German research. Engineers like Adolf Busemann had developed the theoretical foundations for transonic and supersonic flight, work that informed every American jet aircraft designed in the 1950s and beyond. Jet propulsion advances, wind tunnel testing methodologies, and aerodynamic principles all bore the fingerprints of German engineering transplanted to American facilities. The scope went far beyond aerospace. Hans Ziegler's satellite communication research laid groundwork for technologies that would eventually enable global telecommunications. Electronics miniaturization techniques developed for V2 guidance systems influenced the trajectory of American computing. Chemical and biological warfare expertise, some of the most morally troubling knowledge import, became part of US defensive and offensive capabilities. Medical advances emerged from the program as well, though the lineage was rarely acknowledged publicly. Prosthetics development, certain pharmaceutical advances, and aviation medicine protocols all drew on German research. Some of it acquired ethically, some developed under conditions that raised uncomfortable questions about how knowledge obtained through atrocity should be used. Radar systems, guidance technologies, materials science, the contributions spanned disciplines. The scientists weren't just rocket engineers. They were a broad technical cohort whose knowledge accelerated American development across the military-industrial complex. The foundation for what President Eisenhower would later warn against, the permanent fusion of military power and industrial capability, was built in part by men who'd served similar systems in Nazi Germany. The expertise was versatile, the applications were broad, and the moral questions about its origins were consistently set aside in favor of strategic advantage. The technologies developed under Operation Paperclip didn't end with the Cold War. They evolved into systems that define 21st century military capability. Precision-guided munitions trace a direct lineage to German guidance system research. GPS satellite technology, now ubiquitous in civilian life, emerged from military navigation programs that built on principles German scientists helped develop. Hypersonics research, cyber defense architecture, synthetic fuel development, all reflect knowledge transfer that began in the late 1940s. The debate persists. How much was genuine innovation versus leveraging existing German knowledge? The Germans had a head start. Years of wartime research funded lavishly by the Nazi state. American scientists would have reached many of the same conclusions eventually, but Operation Paperclip compressed timelines, providing shortcuts that accelerated development by years, possibly decades. The counter-argument holds that American ingenuity, resources, and institutional capacity would have produced similar results without German assistance. The question becomes whether the moral compromise was worth the time saved, whether accountability could have coexisted with strategic advantage, whether a democracy should ever make the calculation that technical knowledge matters more than how it was acquired. Every advance carries Mittelbau-Dörr's shadow. The expertise that built precision weapons, satellite networks, and aerospace systems was developed, tested, and refined using forced labor under conditions designed to maximize output at the cost of human life. The foundation American technology rests on includes stones laid at a concentration camp. The rocket lineage is clearest in the space program. The Redstone rocket, America's first ballistic missile, was a direct evolution of V2 technology. Jupiter-C carried Explorer-1, America's first satellite, into orbit in 1958, ending the humiliation of Sputnik and announcing American capability in space. The Pershing missile system, deployed throughout the Cold War, reflected design principles and propulsion systems developed at Peenemünde and refined at Huntsville. The Saturn V, the rocket that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon, represented the culmination. Every stage, the engines, the fuel systems, the guidance protocols, emerged from research programs directed by Wernher von Braun and his team. Some innovations were genuinely new, developed specifically for the challenges of lunar travel. But the foundations were German, built on knowledge acquired through a program that prioritized victory over ethics. The question persists: would the United States have succeeded in space without Operation Paperclip? The answer is almost certainly yes. American engineering capacity, industrial infrastructure, and scientific talent were formidable. The Manhattan Project proved that American scientists could achieve what seemed impossible when resources and political will aligned. But it would have taken longer. How much longer is debatable? 5 years, 10, perhaps more. The calculation America made in 1945 was that those years mattered more than accountability, that beating the Soviets to space justified importing men whose expertise came at the cost of 20,000 lives. The cost-benefit analysis was explicit: years gained versus accountability lost. America chose the years. On July 20th, 1969, the Saturn V rocket, designed under von Braun's direction, launched Apollo 11 toward the Moon. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended to the lunar surface, while 600 million people, roughly 1/6 of humanity, watched on television. The achievement was staggering. America had reached the Moon less than a decade after President Kennedy committed the nation to the goal, vindicating enormous investment and validating the strategic decision to prioritize space exploration. American exceptionalism peaked in that moment, proof that democracy, free markets, and technological ambition could accomplish what totalitarian systems couldn't. Wernher von Braun's childhood dream, briefly mentioned as he surrendered in the Bavarian Alps in 1945, had been realized. The boy who'd read science fiction about space travel had become the man who built the machine that sent humans to another world. But the shadow question remained: at what cost? The paradox was unavoidable. America's greatest technological achievement rested on a morally compromised foundation. The same expertise that launched astronauts to the Moon had been developed, tested, and refined at a facility where prisoners died by the thousands. The dream realized in 1969 had been purchased in 1945 with a bargain that traded justice for technical advantage. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Purchased with moral flexibility, achieved through calculated compromise, and celebrated without acknowledging the bodies that made it possible. Operation Paperclip reveals something uncomfortable about democracies under pressure. The values they claim to defend become negotiable when survival feels threatened. The 5 threads that run through this story converge in a single uncomfortable truth. The paperclip, literal object that marked sanitized files, became metaphorical. It represents what nations clip together when choosing expedience: technical knowledge and moral compromise, strategic advantage and historical erasure, achievement and accountability. America clipped together a space program and concentration camp expertise, celebration and silence, exceptionalism and hypocrisy. The eraser worked exactly as designed. Files were rewritten, histories were sanitized, and for decades, the public accepted the narrative that German scientists were apolitical experts whose knowledge happened to be valuable. What America erased wasn't just Nazi Party memberships or SS ranks. It was the question of whether democracies should make these bargains at all. The calculation, the cost-benefit analysis that justified Operation Paperclip, remains the permanent question democracies face. When do ends justify means? Who decides what sacrifices are acceptable? The scientists calculated that America offered better prospects than Soviet capture or war crimes prosecution. America calculated that beating the Soviets mattered more than punishing Nazis. Both calculations proved correct by the metrics that mattered to those making them. The mirror reflects what America didn't want to see. If you welcome former Nazis while denying rights to black citizens, if you celebrate scientists who who used slave labor while prosecuting low-level war criminals? If everyone compromises when convenient, who retains moral authority? The Soviet Union committed atrocities and recruited German scientists. America committed different atrocities and recruited the same German scientists. The mirror showed two superpowers, both willing to sacrifice principles for power. The rocket, von Braun's childhood dream realized on the moon, became the symbol of what could be achieved when nations prioritize capability over accountability. Every Saturn V launch carried the shadow of Mittelbau-Dora. Every advance in aerospace technology rested on knowledge acquired through a program that valued expertise more than justice. The real legacy of Operation Paperclip isn't the rockets, or the satellites, or the precision weapons. It's the precedent. Every time a democracy says, "This time is different," every time strategic necessity overrides stated values, every time a nation calculates that compromise is acceptable if the threat is serious enough, Paperclip whispers from history that the bargain has been made before and will be made again. Modern parallels exist everywhere. Governments partner with authoritarian regimes when economic or security interests align. Intelligence agencies recruit assets with troubling pasts when their knowledge seems valuable. Nations proclaim commitment to human rights while making exceptions for strategic allies. The specific circumstances change, but the calculation remains. When does survival justify setting aside the principles that supposedly define who you are? Operation Paperclip doesn't provide an answer. It asks a question that every generation must wrestle with. If you can erase the past, does it still matter? The bargain America made in 1945, trading justice for rockets, accountability for advantage, moral clarity for technical expertise, is the bargain it's still making. Different names, different technologies, different justifications, but the same fundamental choice: whether the values a democracy claims to defend are absolute or negotiable. Picture a Saturn V rocket on the launch pad. Inside, thousands of hours of Nazi engineering, knowledge acquired through atrocity and refined through forced labor. Above, the American flag. Below, the bodies at Mittelbau-Dora, 20,000 people who died building weapons so that scientists could offer expertise to whichever army won. Between the rocket and the bodies lies silence, the space where accountability should be, where reckoning never came, where justice was delayed until it became irrelevant. That silence is Operation Paperclip's true legacy. Not what was built, but what was accepted. Not what was achieved, but what was forgiven. Not the moon landing, but the calculation that made it possible. The question remains: what are you willing to sacrifice for victory? And when you win, what have you become?